Tonight on Nation to Nation, the scandal involving Justin Trudeau and Jody Wilson-Raybould is still at a fever pitch. Does it mark the end of the Liberals? It already did for Trudeau's senior advisor.
Well, I think this scandal has been extremely corrosive for the credibility of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who ran on sunny ways. Now the architect of sunny ways, Jerry Butts, has been spent packing.
And where is Indigenous child welfare reform legislation, which promised last month, and it's now nearly March?
When are they going to bring the child welfare legislation in? And are we going to do our due diligence in 2 months? I don't think so.
There's one bill sailing through the House. The Indigenous Languages Act passed second reading last night. But the AFN National Chief is still focused on one thing.
Off the bat, what should we concentrate on?
Pass this legislation before June. Make sure it receives royal assent.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamoran, and welcome to Nation to Nation. The scandal involving the Prime Minister and his former Attorney General just isn't going away. The opposition keeps demanding answers. They want to know if the Prime Minister's office pressured Jody Wilson-Raybould to intervene in a criminal case before the courts involving SNC-Lavalin. Justin Trudeau denies he or anyone in his office did so, but we still haven't heard from Wilson-Raybould herself. That may change real soon as she's agreed to appear before the House's Justice Committee. But it brings up another question. Is reconciliation dead? To talk more about it is our political panel. And I'm joined by Parliamentary Secretary for Crown Indigenous Relations, Mark Miller, Conservative MP from Saskatchewan, Kevin Waugh, welcome, and NDP MP from Northern Ontario, Charlie Angus, welcome.
Thank you.
I'll start with you, Mr. Angus. Of course, a couple of days ago you started a motion before the House to get to the bottom of this with an independent inquiry. We, of course, heard that Jody Wilson-Raybould will appear before the Justice Committee. What kind of answers are you expecting from her?
Well, I think this scandal has been extremely corrosive for the credibility of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who ran on sunny ways. Now the architect of sunny ways, Jerry Butts, has been spent packing, ran on reconciliation as the most, the #1 relationship. But it seems that maybe the #1 relationship was protecting the insider friends and the lobbyists. So this is extremely corrosive. Every single day the Liberals come up with a different excuse. So we pushed to have this done independently. Canadians need to know whether or not a company with a long history of allegations of corruption and bribery were able to call right into the Prime Minister's office. They not only managed to have, the law was changed and slipped into an omnibus bill, but then if the prosecution service did not go along with that, did the Prime Minister's office try and pressure the then Justice Minister into interfering? That is a serious, serious allegation. And then out of that came, this whole whisper campaign against Ms. Wilson-Raybould from Liberal insiders who were talking to the media. I can tell you from the communities I represent and the people I'm talking to in Indigenous country, that has sent a very, very stark message that, all this talk about reconciliation, well, it doesn't seem to have panned out to anything other than the same old tawdry, rum bottle politics and backroom influence of Ottawa.
Mr. Waugh, do you think that if Jody Wilson-Raybould appears before the Justice Committee, she can somehow undo any of this damage?
Well, I think we need to hear from the Principal Secretary, Gerald Butts, Katie Telford, and others in Justin Trudeau's PMO office. They were the ones that allegedly put the pressure on the former Attorney General and Justice Minister. The federal prosecutors rejected the settlement, as we know, on September 4th of last year. And then 2 weeks later, now we're finding out, the Prime Minister had another conversation with Jody Wilson-Raybould. So obviously there's been major interference from the PMO office. Those are the ones that need to come towards the Justice Committee. Gerald Butts, Telford, and others. We're going to probably hear from Wilson-Raybould, but we also need to hear from Gerald Butts. All of a sudden, on Family Day, Liberal Family Day, he decides to leave the PMO office. And so I think that is, as a former reporter, I'm putting the dots on. Wilson-Raybould comes back, addresses cabinet, and Butts is gone. There is a connection there in that PMO office, and it leads to the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau.
Mr. Miller, Do you want to respond to any of that, especially the allegation that her appearance at cabinet led to Mr. Butts leaving?
Well, first let me acknowledge the passing of Gary McLean, who was instrumental in spearheading the Indian Day School litigation, and his passing affects us all. An extremely warm person. And I just wanted to acknowledge that here before addressing these important elements. The Prime Minister said at all times that he's acted completely ethically and within his duties as the Prime Minister. What we're seeing here is part of a desire to get to the bottom of a very complex story. Let me say this first and foremost, that Jody Wilson-Raybould is a respected member of the Liberal Party in our caucus, and she is to this day. Her accomplishments as a Justice Minister are noted, particularly very moral issues that we had to tackle, whether we're talking about legalization of cannabis or whether we're talking assisted dying. These are very, very tricky moral and legal issues, and she was instrumental in pushing those forwards, and she's an extremely respected member of our caucus, and there should never have been rumors or innuendo as to her character, some of them bordering on racist. And so as much as my friends here are licking their lips at what they think is a Liberal breakdown, the Prime Minister has said on every occasion he did his job and acted fully legally and in his duty as Prime Minister, and sought counsel from the former Minister of Justice and Attorney General, and it is my expectation that she did precisely her job. Commissions of inquiry, all sorts of forms of chewing at information. I think what you see right now is quite a heavy politicization of what's going on. We will get to the bottom of this, and the truth will come out, and I'm very confident as to the results. And now we can get into the forms and iterations of this, but there is an ethics commissioner who does an impartial job of looking into these things. There is a Justice Committee who is calling Ms. Wilson-Raybould to testify, and so we'll see, and she will be able to speak her truth.
But has some damage been done with, especially with the Indigenous community? A lot of Indigenous leaders think that this has set reconciliation back. I suppose if you're an Indigenous person who wants to run for the Liberal Party coming up in the next federal election, does that damage it?
There's absolutely no question that Jody Wilson-Raybould is an inspiration to Indigenous people across Canada based on her track record and based on her inspiring words. But reconciliation is bigger than any minister, any Prime Minister, and it is going to last this government, no matter how long it lasts, because it is a long path, an extremely arduous and complex path, and I would venture to think that a lot of wounds will be reopened so that we can finally close them. It is not something that can be solved in four-year trenches, and as we as politicians and leaders need to get into that 30-year mindset as opposed to looking towards the next election and what promise can be delivered. So I've been involved in it for a modest amount of time, and it is highly, highly complex. But we have core pieces of legislation, one of which we'll talk about today, the other being language vitalization, which are key to identity and key in creating the basic cores and tenets of nationhood, and the other, child and family services, ensuring that there isn't another scoop going on. So these are extremely important in a long conversation, not between leaders or people at this table necessarily, although they need to happen, but across Canada. Because if the leaders are all together and on the same page and no one else is, we haven't accomplished anything. So this is a long, arduous process.
Mr. Angus, I want to go back to you. I mean, is this scandal distracting lawmakers from more important tasks right now?
Well, I think what we see here is, let's look at two issues out there. Cat Lake. We have a humanitarian disaster, and we have a minister who refuses to show up. He was put into that position after having a terrible track record at Veterans Affairs. So why did the Prime Minister decide to take the minister who was arguably the lowest on the list in terms of delivery and put him into the key area of Indigenous services? We have people being medevaced out of Cat Lake. We've just had a young grandmother die in Cat Lake. The minister has done nothing there, and people are watching and saying, well, what happened to the government that said there was going to be change? The issues that are going on with SNC draws us back. Is this about a government that looks out for its friends? Cat Lake doesn't get to call the Prime Minister's office. They don't get to call Jerry Butts. Neither do any of the other communities in the north. But hey, if you're KPMG, if you're Morneau Chappelle, if you're SNC Lavalin, you've got friends on the inside. And that is issue that people in my region are certainly being very, very growingly frustrated about with this Prime Minister.
Mr. Waugh, I'll give you the last word in this segment. I saw you nodding your head at what Mr. Angus said. Do you agree with him?
Yeah, we need a national inquiry to this. This is the only way this is going to clear up, is if we have an independent national inquiry. That's how this is big right now, between the Prime Minister's office and Justin Trudeau and SNC. So, reconciliation, I do agree with Mark, it's bigger than this. You know, it's paused and everyone's had their 2 cents worth. But, you know, we got to go forward on reconciliation. I will say this. It's funny because the new minister made several announcements last week in Saskatchewan, and he even rented a plane to go up north and put it on Twitter and Facebook, and then took it down after we questioned him about it. So he's got time to come to Regina, got time to come
He flew right over Cat Lake. He could have stopped in. We would have treated him royally. But, man, well, he just flew over.
Yeah, so, you know, in Saskatchewan we're pointing to him because they think they have an opportunity in a northern seat. So they rent this plane. He goes up there, makes a couple of announcements, and then obviously he's very embarrassed about social media and the picture that he took or somebody took and posted, and then they take it down when we start criticizing because there's a 25 to 50% unemployment rate in northern Saskatchewan, and you weren't there long enough to get your ear on the ground. You were more time in the plane taking pictures of yourself on social media.
Okay, well, we could obviously go on and on about this, and probably maybe we will next week. But we have to move on, and we'll take a short break, but when we come back, we continue to look at reconciliation and broken promises. Welcome back. Before the break, we began to look at reconciliation that some believe is on shaky ground with this federal government. Prime Minister started out strong, but nearly 4 years later, and with the fall election approaching, many think reconciliation is on its last legs. It includes a promise to introduce new child welfare legislation. Justin Trudeau said it would be tabled in January. It's almost March and it still hasn't seen the light of day in the House of Commons. We go back to our panel of MPs. I'll start with you, Mr. Miller. The bill requires First Nations to make a deal with your government to get jurisdiction. I suppose why can't we just give jurisdiction back? Why do we need this legislation?
Oh, there's a number of complex issues that exist under the Constitution, particularly its interplay with provinces. We clearly intend to introduce the legislation during this session because we know of its importance. We know of its importance to children foremost and to families that have been separated them, and as well as the industry, sometimes in non-Indigenous communities that has existed in effectively creating what we decried previously as a 60s scoop. So ensuring that families are able to raise their children is a basic element of what it means to be as a family unit, but also a major element of what it means to be in a society and a core element of identity. Because we're talking about reconciliation, because we've talked about all the mistakes that we've made simply by ramming things down people's throats, we know that this has to be done in partnership with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and it is not something that is easy, and we don't pretend it to be easy. It is.
But we've heard rumors that the drop dead date was earlier this week. I mean, aren't we out of time though?
We're not out of time. We fully intend. I can't disclose it here because it isn't within my privilege to do so. But we fully intend to introduce it during this session and have it passed. There are a lot of elements that are not under our control. That is the nature in and of itself of the parliamentary process. It's also the nature of reconciliation.
Mr. Angus, what do you believe that this promise can be met, or it's been broken already?
Well, I think we need to put in perspective that the very first thing this government was hit in terms of the reconciliation agenda was the Human Rights Tribunal ruling that found Canada systemically guilty of systemic racist discrimination against children. And the government fought that ruling, over $2 million in legal fees, 3 to 4 non-compliance orders that resulted in children dying in Wapakika because the government refused to meet their obligations. And now they're forced legally under the Jordan's principle because of the court ruling, but they continue to fight the implementation and protection of Indigenous children. So that has slowed things down dramatically. In terms of the child welfare legislation, I hear from the government saying we have to get it right and we're going to do it in partnership and blah, blah, blah. But who are they talking to? Because they aren't talking to the people on the ground. They certainly haven't been talking to Cindy Blackstock. So unless we have really clear markers in there, for example, statutory obligations in terms of the funding models, we're going to see a slapdash effort that's doomed to fail, that will end up being, you know, an vague election promise. But the need to do this was one of the key elements that came out of that tribunal ruling. And now, what is it? We're just a couple months away from the election. So they've hemmed and hawed, and they've dodged, and they've weaved. They haven't done the groundwork. So my sense is that this is dead on the order paper, and we have not seen goodwill from the government.
Mr. Waugh, you mentioned, of course, in our last segment how important reconciliation is. It's a 30-year thing, not just 4 years. So if Conservative government got in, is this something you would pick up? Is this child welfare reform bill if it dies?
I mean, yeah, that's true, Todd. I mean, you look right now, the Indigenous groups I talk with, it's all about capacity. If we bring in this child welfare, they want a chance to have the capacity to deal with this. And let's face it, some of the bands in this country right now are low on capacity. It's going to take them a few years to catch up. Others are right there. And when I talk to my groups in Western Canada in particular, this is the big thing for them, is the capacity. Now, I understand provinces like mine, Saskatchewan and Ontario, are very concerned about that. But at the same time, this government, I mean, we only have one sitting week in March. So when are they going to bring the child welfare legislation in? And are we going to do our due diligence in 2 months? I don't think so. So it's a promise broken by the Liberal government. There's no question on that. And they haven't talked to Cindy Blackstock. They haven't talked to a lot of people. And who is writing the legislation? I've heard some rumors. The government's, you know, kind of farm pieces out. And so it's going to be interesting if it ever does come in this 42nd Parliament to take a look at this.
Mr. Miller, I'll give you the last word, especially on this allegation by Mr. Waugh that this legislation has been farmed out.
Look, you can be outraged all you want, but this government has put billions of dollars into child and family service support, education, and now languages. This is a critical element to ensuring that there are the steps towards self-determination. If you look at past practice, the NDP, they ran on a platform that wanted to balance the budget. How would they have done that? And they can be outraged all they want, but the proof is not in the pudding with them. They talk a big game and they decry things, but they would never have put any investment into this, as far as I can tell. And the Conservatives as well. Everyone knows their track record. So this is the challenge that Canadians need to face. They need to look at the firm track record that we've established, cognizant of the fact that we need to do more, and I will not deny that at any point in time. But this is a long path. It is an absolutely difficult one and an absolutely necessary one.
Okay, well, we're out of time. I want to thank you, gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We'll have more after another short break. Welcome back. It may be hard to tell, but other things are going on in Ottawa of interest to Indigenous people. One of those is Bill C-91, the Indigenous Languages Act. It aims to support and revitalize languages. It has broad support among political parties. However, Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami President Natan Obed does not like the legislation. He says the Inuit were not consulted enough, so that's why it passed second reading last night with 279 yes votes to only 1 no. And that came from MP Hunter Tutu.
All those opposed will please rise.
Mr. Tutu.
He acknowledged his dissenting vote during committee hearings on C-91.
I know I was probably surprised a few people today, but I'm very confident that through this process of committee and my discussion with the minister, that some amendments would be able to come to some common ground, and some amendments with the Inuit to have unanimous support at third reading on this. So I just want to make that very clear right off the bat.
Assembly of First Nations National Chief Perry Bellegarde expressed his main interest with the legislation when asked this question by Conservative MP David Yerdiga.
So what would you like to see the initial steps? What should we do? What's off the bat, what should we concentrate on?
Pass this legislation before June. Make sure it receives royal assent. That's what this is all about. If we don't get it done by June, well, my goodness gracious, we lost an opportunity. We don't know what's going to happen in October. And even if there's a continuation, there might be a change. We don't know. Will anybody be supportive of another Indigenous Languages Revitalization Act? We don't know. So we miss an opportunity. So there's a sense of urgency to get this done now.
NDP MP Georgina Jollybois wanted clarification on how funding will reach people and organizations who live off reserve.
To ensure that they have access to funding as well as is our on reserve, as well as the Métis settlements and the Métis governments. Have you had those discussions and advocated strongly for them as well?
I made the point earlier on about the need and use of technology to make sure that everybody has access to these services and programs, right? Whether you're on the reserve or off reserve. But as well, I talked about the need for provincial government involvement as well.
Right.
This is federal government, but the role of the provinces, because they control the curriculums, and they also have monies transferred from the feds for three things: education, healthcare, and social services through EPF financing. So there's a role for provincial governments as well, and I lifted up the BC government for providing $50 million for Indigenous language revitalization.
But then Jolly Bois asked about how to get Conservative governments in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario to support C91.
But it really becomes incumbent upon chiefs and leadership right across Canada to as well not only exert pressure on the policy and legislative makers, decision makers nationally, but provincially as well. And I used the example earlier on about how in Saskatchewan it's law to teach treaties in the classroom from kindergarten to grade 12 in the curriculums. It's legislated, it's law. So that came about from a very strategic lobby effort, advocacy effort to do that.
Order. I'm having trouble hearing the answer. We have to hear the questions and the answers.
And what about question period today in the House? No surprise, the opposition continued to hammer the government over SNC-Lavalin and having solicitor-client privilege waived so Jody Wilson-Raybould can speak her truth.
Because yesterday, the former Justice Minister stood in this House not once but twice and told her colleagues, every member of this House, that she is being silenced in her ability by this Prime Minister. His treatment of her is not just spiteful. It's not just pusillanimous. This is about the exercise of power and protecting his friends and his insiders, and one woman with integrity is standing in his path. So what's he afraid of? Let her speak her truth, her power to him.
A clerk of the Privy Council confirmed today that months after the former Attorney General had made it clear that she would not interfere in an ongoing court proceeding involving SNC-Lavalin, the Prime Minister refused to accept that decision and continued to pressure the former Attorney General to change her mind. The Director of Public Prosecutions had made a decision. The former Attorney General had made the decision. Why did the Prime Minister then make the decision to try to obstruct justice in an ongoing legal proceeding? Here, here.
The Honourable Government House Leader.
The member seems to believe that if you raise your voice, all of a sudden there's more validity to what you're saying. Mr. Speaker, the record has stated, I've said, and I'll continue to say, the Justice Committee is doing the work. He can raise his voice louder if he wants to, but the Justice Committee has asked for witnesses to appear. Members have asked questions. Witnesses are answering questions. But it was last week that the Director of Public Prosecution Service confirmed that prosecutors in every case, quote, exercise their discretion independently and free from any political or partisan consideration.
And that's our show for this week. And if you missed any part of it or any past episode, you can check out our podcasts. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Todd Lamoran. Thanks for watching.